You're watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. It's great to be joined from Panchkula by Admiral Sunil Lanba. He's the last Chief of Naval Staff and the current Chairman of the National Maritime Foundation. Admiral, good to see you after a while.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you for inviting me to join in this discussion. My pleasure.
It's our pleasure, actually. Also joining us is Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa. She's been an ex-ambassador to Japan. I know you are busy with a dinner a little later, Ambassador Wadhwa, so thank you for giving us some time.
Pleasure to be here, Amitabh. Perfect. Really happy to be here.
Also is the ex-Indian High Commissioner to Australia, Ambassador Navdeep Singh Suri. Ambassador Suri, good to see you back on StratNews, sir.
Thank you, Amitabh, and keep up the good work at StratNews.
It's a pleasure, sir. It's all because of guests like you. Admiral, just coming to you about the Quad. Now, it started off with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in 2004. It's died at least one death and been resurrected. How do you see it now? When you were in uniform, you would say that there was no need for a military dimension. With things having changed, especially with China along the northern borders, the LAC, Ladakh, Galwan, etc., what's your take, Admiral?
I think the Quad has come a long way. It's been upgraded to now ministerial level. And the meeting which has taken place in Japan at this time in the pandemic, and our foreign minister having gone and attended, the meeting goes a long way in showing our commitment to the Quad. And I think it is a necessity in this day where the aggressive behavior of China and like-minded nations need to come together, otherwise they'll continue to bully their smaller neighbors around.
Admiral, in terms of the military dimension, do you see it progressing?
I think at the moment it is too premature that there has been a mention in Minister Jaishankar's opening statement for maritime security. But I think we have still a long way to go before there is actually a military dimension to the Quad.
Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, are we still treading on eggshells? When you're talking about the foreign secretary there was no real mention about China or Ladakh or the issues, of course, to read between the lines, between all the statements, and privately they would have obviously brought it up. Are we still treading on eggshells when it comes to talking about the Quad and what really it is representing?
Well, as you said, Amitabh, it's quite clear, and I think there were statements that this was certainly on the agenda and was discussed. Now, I think it's interesting how each of the countries have alluded to it, but elliptically. Of course, the Americans were quite in your face, and you know what Pompeo said, and he, of course, elicited a response immediately from the Chinese. I don't think any of the others wanted to do that. But Australia was also pretty direct in what they said. I mean, there was no mistake who they were alluding to. You heard Jaishankar talk about, about sovereignty and territorial integrity and so on. Obviously, we were talking also about China. And if you see what Japan says, it just mentioned the East China Sea. When they talk about threats in the East China Sea, they are talking about China. So I think everybody in their own way did bring up China, but, not as directly. And I think there is no real point in doing that, you see, because the kind of reaction that you get. But there is no mistake that they have got together, and I think this is progress because of the threat of China in the region.
Ambassador Suri, do you agree? I mean, there was no joint statement as the Quad has separate statements there in foreign ministry level, two of them that we've had. Is there no necessity to call out China directly if you're alluding to them in the different ways that different countries need to? I think we're having an issue with...
Reminded of that old samajhne wage and na samjhe.
No, go ahead, Mr. Suri. I think there's a slight lag, but go ahead.
I said, I'm reminded of that old song, "Samajhne wale samajh gaye hain, na samjhe mein banari hain." So the message is very clear in the statements and that have come out. And I think what we are beginning to see, on your earlier question to Admiral Lamba on the military dimension of it or the strategic dimension of it, I think what we are beginning to see is incremental steps. When I was in Canberra, the first white shipping agreement between India and Australia was signed, and that was aimed at least trying to build maritime domain awareness. Since then, we've had fairly ambitious exercises. The last exercise in Australia, you actually had an Australian submarine participate, and you had all of those anti-submarine operations underway. Now we have the agreement on the use of facilities. So if you look at the way in which the bilateral relationships are progressing between individual Quad members, the reality is that today India has an agreement with Japan, with the US, and with Australia, and I think all of that adds to giving it the security and strategic framework, even though we may not wish to say it upfront in so many words.
Let me just take a comment that's coming from Scott Gordon, because that is the presumption when we say China, but we are of course talking about the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping and the leaders, not the Chinese people as such. Scott Gordon says, as such, the problem is not China, it's the CCP under Xi. That's a given. We're just alluding to the CCP when we use China. Admiral Lamba, what Ambassador Suri was talking about, it's not, the Quad hasn't functioned in the maritime domain together as yet. We're still waiting for Malabar to have Australia as well. But like he's pointing out, bilaterally, even among these four countries and other countries in the region, there have been a lot of exercises which allow both navies or multiple navies to learn how to operate together.
Bilaterally, the navies have come a long way in operating together. Malabar has been going on with the United States since 1993, and with the inclusion of Japan and also exercising bilaterally with all the three navies. And as Ambassador Suri had said, the level of sophistication of exercises with the Australian Navy, with all the three navies, is really in the forefront. We have operated together in RIMPAC, all the four navies, with a large number of other navies. Australia, United States, and India have a very potent common platform in the maritime patrol aircraft, the Boeing P-8, and they've operated together in RIMPAC. And all the four navies have common procedures and standard operating procedures. So we are a long way down on understanding each other, and there is a degree of comfort between all the four navies of operating together. And I don't see any issue with also inclusion of Australia in the Malabar. It's a political decision which has to be taken both by India and Australia. The navies have given a go-ahead of participating together in Malabar.
Sure, we are expecting that it's because of COVID,
And,
maybe.
One more point is also we have a logistics agreement now with Australia, Japan, and the United States. United States, we had a fuel exchange agreement which was signed in 2003. And now with the Limova, we've come a long way in supporting each other's operations in both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean.
Ambassador Wadhwa, specifically about your experience in Japan and how you see the transition from Abe Shinzo to Yoshihide Suga. There is a lot of analysis which says that he would probably be more inward-looking, like many of our countries are, because of Corona, because of the economy, etc. But how do you see the transition? Because it was Abe Shinzo 2007, the Conference of the Seas speech in the Indian Parliament, which triggered all this off at that level.
I think, the best marker and indicator is the fact that they decided to have this Quad foreign ministers meeting in person in Tokyo. There were talk of other venues, but they decided it in Tokyo. And I'm sure that was also a political signaling that, Suga is ready to really engage with the world. And ever since he's taken on, he has worked the phones and called all the major, world leaders of importance, including, of course, our own Prime Minister and Chinese Prime Minister and so on. Interestingly, he started with Australia. But besides that, he's also said very clearly that he would, to the extent possible, be following the foreign and security policy of Abe. And, he's very much, in a way, a mentee of Abe. He was his chief cabinet secretary. So we can see continuity. And as I said, really, the fact that they met in person, last time it was, and before this, it was always on the margins of international conferences. Here, despite COVID, they all decided to actually travel, including Pompeo. He canceled the other meetings, go to Tokyo and have this meeting. I think the greatest significance really of the Quad, of this meeting, is that they met there, and then they also said that they would have regular meetings thereafter, and also at the official and the expert level. So we are seeing really a crystallization, a more sort of move towards institutionalization. And Japan is very much on board, because after all, this was Abe's idea, the whole concept of the Quad.
Master Suri, when you talk about Australia and, Secretary Pompeo, of course, cancelled, I think, his Mongolia and Korea visits, but did continue to the Quad. The Australian Foreign Minister, Payne, I believe, came there despite the fact that when she goes back, she will probably have to be quarantined for 14 days as per Australian regulations, which indicates how important Australia is in the Quad. And would you say there's been a huge change this year in Australia's stance towards China, starting off with asking for those international inquiries about the origins of the virus?
Amitabh, along with India, I think Australia has probably been at the receiving end of some of the most aggressive and egregious behavior by the Chinese. While the immediate provocation in Chinese minds might have been the Australian demand for an inquiry into the origins of the novel coronavirus, but really the roots of Australian angst are a bit deeper than that. At least they go back 5 years. Australians have woken up to the fact that China was literally trying to infiltrate into every major institution of the country, from politics to academia to research to media to think tanks to whatever. And there was this real sense that Australia is becoming richer by selling raw materials to China, but where is this going to take? So they've actually embarked on a series of defensive measures. And today you see that very clearly in the steps that they've taken to protect really their institutions against China's aggressive behavior. I think Prime Minister Morrison himself is particularly mindful, because when he was Treasury Secretary, he had to deal with Chinese attempts to take over first the Darwin port, and then the Kidman estates, and then the electricity network, the fiber optic and electricity network in New South Wales, and all of those things that required Australia to tighten up its foreign investment regime, its vetting of Confucius institutes, the Foreign Interference and Transparency Act, by which politicians were receiving the contributions from Australian Chinese billionaires, and all of that stuff. So I think Australia has shown a lot of resolve in the last 6 months. And that's why you see them at the receiving end now of China putting an 80% tariff on Australian barley, on Australian wines being subjected to an anti-dumping inquiry, technical objection against Australian meat, and so on. And Australia recognizes that it is almost uniquely vulnerable to that kind of economic coercion from China, because last year 38% of Australian exports went to China. That's how impactful Chinese behavior can be. And despite that, the Australians have sort of stiffened their resolve and said that we will deal with it, even if it means accepting some temporary pain.
Admiral, you were talking about interoperability. If I can get you to elaborate on how the Indian Navy, which has such a vast legacy of ex-Soviet and Russian vessels can operate with mostly Western navies in these exercises, and if need be in the future when it comes to any kind of action?
Oh, the Indian Navy has done a marvelous job of integrating systems from all over the world on a platform. Say, like you take the latest Kolkata class destroyers, it has weapons and sensors made in India from Israel, some Russian weapons, and they all integrate within the vessel. And when you operate with other navies, the basic issue initially when we started doing bilateral exercise was how do you communicate with the ships participating. So initially it was all dependent on voice communication. Now there are all black boxes and data boxes which are fitted for the exercise, and the ships now not only there's no voice communication, there's all data transfers, and the operations rooms of the ships get linked, so data is transferred from one ship to another who are participating in the exercise. And with the signing of Comcasa now, also American data kits will now be already being tried out and they will be fitted. And with common platforms, like I mentioned, the Boeing, now we're also getting the helicopters, which are also operated by Australia. And the Japanese also have similar platforms. So data transfer boxes will fit it, and there will be no issue of transferring operational data from one ship to another. So we have come a long way, and there's no issue of what the platform speaks to another platform. It's not the sensor to sensor.
Master Wadhwa, just in terms of Japanese history and how the constitution was amended to a certain extent to allow military forces, and how Japan has moved forward since then in terms of bilateral exercises. It's not just in the maritime domain. I think in all tri-services that with India at least, even in Pakistan for that matter, in the maritime domain. How is Japan dealing with domestic issues when it comes to China and its history?
The layers of this. So, insofar really as yes, Japan has been actively participating in bilateral exercises. Very keen to join the Malabar. It persisted for a very long time. It was an ad hoc member of the Malabar till it got its way. And I must mention here, in fact, the Admiral mentioned it because the signing of the AXA, which was logistics agreement, was done despite the fact that the summit didn't happen. It should have happened at the summit.
Yeah.
So also shows the importance that both countries place on it, and the interoperability of all the four members of the Quad. Now on the China issue, it's interesting because they engage at two levels. One is a very, very deep economic engagement, an intermeshing of the two economies. So you have something like 35,000 Japanese companies that operate in China. And now the Japanese are talking of decoupling and diversifying supply chains, which is incidentally was also the supply chain, the initiative, the resilience initiative was talked by at least 2 or 3 of the countries during the Quad meeting. But you find resistance to that. But the reality is that the two economies are extremely closely enmeshed. On the political front, what is happening is that there was a period of some cooling off after 2012 when 3 of the Senkaku Islands, the Kyayu Islands, were bought by the Japanese government, and since then we've had almost very regular and sometimes daily incursions of their airspace and their maritime space by the Chinese. So there you have the sense of where militarily they are threatened by the Chinese. But politically, they have tried under Abe, tried very much to try and balance the relationship and bring some kind of normalcy to it. So what we found was that in 2018, October, Abe finally made a bilateral visit to Beijing. They signed several agreements of working together on the PRI, which, as you know, was a very sensitive issue, and also that Xi Jinping would visit Tokyo. Now, were it not for COVID that he would have visited Tokyo in April, they're still talking of a new date. So really Japan engages with China at different levels and maintains a balance. But having said that, the fact that they do seek out groupings such as the Quad and all these naval interactions and joint exercises with not only the Quad members but others too, it shows that they do have concerns as far as the security is concerned. And this is also, the alliance is there with the US, but perhaps they want to have other options outside the alliance too. So it's interesting where they come from.
Master Suri, on Australia, again, before I take your comments on how India should be developing the Quad, if it should be stepping it up. Australia, there are people who say India is the weak link, but Australia in the past has been the weak link. I mean, one of the reasons why it almost nearly died was because of Australia and the change in government. So what makes India or the others so certain about Australia's position because of how it's behaved in the past?
I think two things have changed. One is that was, I think, a momentary lapse when Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister, and he, of course, was deeply wedded to Australia's China policy and proximity to China, and he's himself a Mandarin speaker and all of that. So I think there was a blip that happened. We rubbed it against the Australians for years. Each time during my tenure, they would approach us to do more on the Quad. We would remind them, oh, but do you remember what much water has flowed under the bridge since then? One is Australian politics has changed. There's a different party in power. And the new Prime Minister, both this one and in fact the previous one, Malcolm Turnbull, took a harder position on China. But the second is the Chinese behavior has changed. This is inescapable. So the same parameters that might have applied 7 or 8 years back no longer apply. It's not just the Australians have changed due to Chinese aggression. We have changed due to Chinese aggression. I mean, I remember when the Australians used to push us to join the Quad at a more senior level and be more forthcoming. One of the arguments that I remember being made by our side was, what's the problem? We have a triangle between India, Japan, and the US. We have a triangle with India, Australia, US. Two triangles make a quad, and so be it. I think both of us have moved a lot, and the two factors that are contributing to it, frankly. One is the Chinese aggression, which we are subjected to, and the second is also the uncertainty about the United States, the mercurial nature of US politics, which encourages some of the other middle powers to hedge their bets and seek out each other rather than finding themselves totally dependent on a country that says, I'm out of this country, I'm into this country, so I think there's a push factor and there's a pull factor both at work.
Admiral Lanba, in thinking in the opening comments also, you made that statement that things have changed, so countries' responses have also changed. How do you see, or how would you wish India to be responding to the current situation, especially when it is vis-a-vis China?
See, as far as the Quad is concerned, we have to be cognizant of the fact that India is the only member of the Quad which has a very long unresolved land border with China. And also the differential in national power, whether you take economy or military power, say like Chinese economy is at least 5 to 6 times ours. The defense budget is 5 times our budget. Okay. We have surprised them by our action, what has happened in the LAC now. I'm quite sure neither of the country wants a full-blown war on the LAC, neither China nor India. So taking this out into account, there is a question why this LAC situation has been raised at the moment. Jury is still out and there are a lot of theories of why this has happened on the LAC. But when push comes to shove, like Ambassador Suri said, I think a lot will depend what happens on 3rd of November in the United States and who is going to be the next president, whether it's going to be President Trump or ex-Vice President Joe Biden gets elected, and what policy is going to happen. And there is always a doubt in each country's mind. Actually, we should have a doubt in our mind. What will be the commitment of Australia and Japan if push comes to shove? Whether there is a military dimension to it. The kind of economic linkages which are there of all the 4 members of Quad with China, it's a fact on ground. We can't wish that away. And the other point which we also need to keep in mind is the size of China. It's too big to be sorted out by any country in the world at the moment, in my particular opinion. And in the South China Sea, the genie's out of the bottle. What should have been done in 2012 and 13? The world at large has allowed the island building, and now they have been militarized. And really, the freedom of navigation exercises doesn't make any material difference. Okay, the ships go through, China makes a noise and howls about it. A message is sent to the world at large that we need to follow international rules and order, but doesn't change materially on the ground what is happening in the South China Sea. So we have to be cognizant of this reality on ground, and we should. And for far too long, we haven't been as forthcoming in our policy to China. We have been taken in and really believed their statements and the treaties which we have signed with them, honored none of them. I think I've taken too much time. I'll stop here.
Not at all. Ambassador Wadhwa, when it comes to the Quad, now ASEAN, though all the statements, or most of them will at least say ASEAN is a central part of the Indo-Pacific structure. The Chinese know how to play ASEAN. They can find the weakest link there, and they have been finding the weakest link there. How do you not make the Quad seem exclusive to the ASEAN countries and any other countries who want to join as well?
See, this was certainly a concern, which is why one point of commonality in all the statements was the centrality of the ASEAN and the ASEAN outlook and so on. So they certainly do not want to ruffle any feathers as far as ASEAN is concerned. And, geographically also, they do have a very important position in the area. As far as the other countries are concerned, it's interesting because both Japan and Australia talks about the possibility of already adding other countries to the Quad. And this was something surprising because, this is really, it's work in progress right now. And you already have them talking about the possibilities of the Europeans. I think the Japanese talked about the Europeans and of adding other like-minded countries. So I think what is really going to happen is that we will certainly work with the ASEAN countries. And one of the things to note is I read somewhere that Prime Minister Suga's first foreign visit is going to be to Vietnam and Indonesia. So Japan is also bilaterally, building relationships which have some kind of defense and security dimensions with the Philippines, with Vietnam, with Indonesia. And, we are, I think, of course, the problem with the ASEAN is that, China does have, certainly has a lot of influence, particularly on some of the smaller countries, as we know. But to, in a way, build a stronger relation with some of them, who also see China as a threat, I think is something that each one of us perhaps would be doing.
Just to build on what you're saying, Ambassador Wadhwa, do you see this incremental progression of the Quad to at some point in your future also have 2+2?
2+2 is an interesting thing because, the only one who really mentioned this was the former Japanese Defense Minister Taro Kono, who mentioned it, saying that, why could it not be? So I think this is an idea which is, its time will come. So right now you have first the regularization of the foreign ministers and, meetings. So perhaps its time will really come, it's quite possible.
Ambassador, if you want to take that question and any other comments on how India should be taking the Quad and how it has been dealing with it.
Yeah, I think, look, the Quad Plus is already coming up for discussion. The Australians have mentioned Indonesia, the Japanese have mentioned Vietnam as possible candidates, simply because there's a certain commonality of interests involved. The 2+2 is something quite significant in my opinion, because again, Ambassador Deepa would recall it, I recall it from my days in Australia, how keen the Australians, for example, were for a 2+2 and how reluctant we were. We were literally, we had to be bulldozed into it by our own leadership. And eventually we agreed at the secretary level, not at the ministerial level. Now, with Australia, for example, we've said that annually, biannually, it can be at the ministerial level, and otherwise it is at the foreign sector level. So that upgrade kind of has been done. And what it does is it brings a clear security dimension to the relationship. So, the fact that with all that is going on October 26, 27, both Secretary of State Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mike Esper are coming to Delhi for the 2+2, tells you that this has now become an integral part of the foreign and security policy framework. And, India is today a far more willing player in this than we were even 3 years back. So, I think we need to take note of the evolution of India's own policy and doctrine in this regard. I just want to make one point, which taking off on what Admiral Lamba had said, and perhaps we can have a further discussion on that, is the economic dimension of the Quad. And really, we shouldn't neglect that, because when you look at the state emanated out.
Ambassador, we see. Go ahead. I think we can hear you now.
Okay. You see a certain commonality of language. You see the India, Australia, Japan foreign commerce ministers having met to discuss supply chain resilience. You see the incentives that Japan is trying to give to some of its businesses to diversify their supply chains. You see the language on critical information infrastructure, cybersecurity. You see the concerns on 5G and the shared interest in making sure that alternatives are available which are more secure. You look at the emphasis on rare earths, so that you don't get blackmailed by one country in terms of critical requirements. I think these are really important dimensions which are in addition to whatever is being discussed on the maritime security or the defense side. And to the extent that these can take forward, to the extent that India, Australia, Japan have already had their first commerce ministers virtual meeting on this, should be given due importance when we discuss the Quad.
Admiral Lamba, your thoughts, because that's one of the ways that you have to push back against China, which is to diversify your supply chains. But also wanted to get your comment on, do you think the next step in the evolution of the Quad is the need for a Quad 2+2?
See, the first 2+2 was with the United States, and that's come a really long way on the levels of discussion which have taken place. I participated in the first 2+2 which took place a couple of years back. So we have now graduated from joint secretary levels to the foreign ministers level. And I agree with what Ambassador Suri is saying. Individually, we are doing 2+2 with a number of countries. Also, the reluctance with Australia is slowly moving away. And I think time will come where I think sooner than later when we will have a 2+2 in the Quad also.
Sure. Just wanted a quick comment from you, Admiral. Also, when you were talking about, say, Lemma and Comcasa and the other foundational agreements with the US, and we hear maybe even Becca could come soon. In terms of, we've already seen numerable, say, refueling at sea. And I think it was INS Talwar, which was the most recent one from a US Navy tanker. But you've also seen a P-8A from the American Air Force landing at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And considering how crucial that is in terms of the Malacca Straits, do you think India will be or should be encouraging other countries to also use the Andaman and Nicobar Islands?
I think we've come a long way where Andaman and Nicobar Islands always used to be a no-no for especially the US naval ships visit. And the refueling of a P-8 in Andaman is one big step which we have finally taken, and it is a step in the right direction. Especially the Limoa with United States really helps us. They have a huge logistics infrastructure which no other country has. And it's not only Talwar refueling. Way back when I was commanding a ship in 2005, I refueled from a US tanker in the Med. So it's a big Limova. The logistics agreement with France was also. We have hosted the ships in the naval base. We have sent a Boeing to Reunion. So these logistics agreements expand the reach and sustenance of the Indian Navy in the far reaches of the Indian Ocean and also in Western Pacific. And now, which we already have with 7 countries, and now with UK and Australia and Russia also, the facilities will become available, and the reach and sustenance of the Navy, the Indian Navy, will be in the Indo-Pacific to a very large extent.
Sure.
And it's not only fuel and all that, is also spares, infrastructure. See, like our logistics agreement with Singapore, you can go and use the Changi Naval Base, which we have done on a number of times. And we have a long-standing arrangement with Singapore. And I think one of the oldest running bilateral exercises between the two navies. We celebrated the 25th year of India-Singapore naval exercises in 2018.
Right. Ambassador Wadhwa, if you'd like to come in on the economic aspect of that and how important that is. They've been talking about supply chain resilience. I suspect there'll be a lot more talk on that. Cyber, like Ambassador Suri mentioned, 5G as well. All these are key issues. And the glue, of course, is China.
Yeah, indeed, Amitabh, because I'm glad that Navdeep mentioned this, because you see another very important aspect of the economic relationship, and all of them mentioned it. All the countries mentioned it during their readouts, post their statements, and their own the statements they issued, and whatever their initial comments were. And this is quality infrastructure. And when they talk about quality infrastructure, they're making a difference between what the Chinese give, which is not so much of standardized quality, but quality infrastructure is very important. Connectivity is something I think our own foreign minister talked about, our EM talked about. So there are many the economic aspects also which are there, and you're very right in mentioning them. There were the supply chains. What did happen was that while Japan did not mention it, but later in the bilateral strategic dialogue that he had with EM Jaishankar, that was certainly mentioned. Again, they talked about cooperation in the context of COVID and also the post-COVID world. And here, actually, EM was talking about the financial dimensions, because the post-COVID world is going to put a lot of economic stress in all countries. So I think, how do we work together? This is going to be a very, very important area where the Quad countries would work together and have to work together. And yes, Australia was one of the countries that mentioned critical minerals and cybersecurity. And I think cybersecurity, because they were under so much of attack recently, so they really did flag it. What did follow soon after the Quad meeting was our strategic dialogue. And there, as you know, the text has been finalized. of a memorandum on cooperation in cybersecurity. The Japanese themselves, I think, under Suga, one of his priorities is to go in for very massive digitization, particularly of public services and so on. So he did talk about that. And I think here there are opportunities to work together. And I think perhaps also benefit to our companies to really cooperate in this particular area. So yes, this has as a very, very important economic dimension.
That's Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa. Thank you so much for your experience and your insight on the show. I could have gone on forever, but both you and Ambassador Suri, thanks for your expertise and lots of comments here that I'm wishing both of you on the Indian Foreign Service Day. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for those wishes.
And Admiral Lanba, great to see you again, sir. I hope you're putting up your feet after hanging up your boots. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's been my pleasure. We had an interesting discussion.
And you can get all the latest news and analysis on our website. If you do like our journalism, go on to StratNews Global and support us. You've been watching StratNews Global and Talking Point. I'm Amitabh.